Before this story continues, please allow me to make one thing clear. The story you are about to hear is a fictional narrative created for entertainment and educational purposes, reflecting toxic family conflict and the inner journey of a woman who endured in silence for far too long. All characters' events and details are entirely fictional and are not based on any real individuals or actual events. The content may be supported by AI tools during creation and production. This story does not promote violence, hatred, or harm of any kind. It is told to evoke empathy, reflection, and personal growth, especially for women who have sacrificed, remained patient, and been hurt within their own families. The entire narrative is built to be advertiser-friendly, compliant with YouTube community policies, and does not aim to defame, target, or imply any real person. If you recognize a piece of your own life in this story, please stay until the end, and if your heart is touched, share your feelings in the comments, or follow the channel to continue with stories for women who have carried too much and still deserve understanding and respect. Okay, now let me tell you what happened. My name is Taryn. I am 27. I work in hospitality operations. That is what I tell people because it sounds ordinary, and it keeps conversations short. I like quiet places. I notice small things, the way someone grips a glass when they are nervous, the way a room changes when one person raises their voice just a little. I keep notes in my phone because memory lies and details do not. My stepdad Richard is in his early 60s and retired-ish in the way men say when they want credit for having opinions without responsibility. He likes to joke with an edge and call it wisdom. My mom Linda is 58 and believes peace is more important than truth, especially when truth might cause an argument at the table. Evan is my stepbrother. He is 34, married, owns a house, has a car with a payment, and is celebrated for doing what is expected. We were all in Naples, Florida that week, the kind of place where golf carts hum past trimmed lawns and people gather for community dinners to feel connected. It was Thanksgiving week, November 2024, and my mom had invited neighbors and a couple from Richard's club. I arrived with my old laptop bag because it works and because no one questions it. The house smelled like roasted turkey and citrus cleaner. Plates clinked. People settled into chairs. Then Richard did something he had planned. I know that now because the envelope was already on the table, placed carefully in front of my seat before I even sat down. He slid the papers across the table. Everyone watched my hands, like I was the problem they had finally fixed. The top page said, Power of Attorney. There were others underneath about co-signing and releases related to my mom's house and medical decisions for convenience, as he put it with a smile that invited laughter. Sign it, he said lightly. It's time you stop pretending you're an adult. Someone chuckled. Someone else cleared their throat. My mom did not look at me. Evan smiled the way people do when they are relieved the spotlight is not on them. The guests looked at me with something like sympathy mixed with curiosity, as if this were a demonstration. I felt my face warm, and then oddly calm. I did not shout. I did not stand up. I did not ask for a private conversation. I looked at the papers and at the pens lined up like tools, and I thought about a truth that comes with age. When someone tries to corner you in public, the smartest thing you can do is stop reacting and start collecting facts. Richard leaned back, enjoying the room. Enjoying. He made another joke about how kids drift these days and how failure sometimes needs a firm nudge. He used the word failure. Out loud. In front of people who would remember it. My mom stared at the gravy boat. Evan adjusted his watch. I could feel the pressure of the moment, the expectation that I would comply to keep things smooth. This was not help. This was control, wrapped in politeness. If you have ever been pressured by family to sign something to make their lives easier, type I see you in the comments. I did not sign. I asked to read. Richard waved his hand dismissively and said, we can explain later, but let's not make a scene. The irony landed heavy. Making a scene was the point. Over the next hour, the conversation moved on, but the message did not. Jokes landed at my expense. Still loading, Richard said, and people laughed. He suggested that managing assets required maturity and that some people were not ready. He implied that my mom's house needed proper oversight and that I was not reliable. Each comment was a step closer to the same place, me being smaller. I thought about the last 5 years, about how I never asked them for money, about how I paid for the roof repair without making it a thing, about the short phone calls I took sometimes where I said, "Send the revised terms," and hung up. No one asked. They did not want to know. After dinner, I heard my mom in the kitchen whispering to Richard, "If she signs, it will be easier for everyone." Easier. That word did not include me. I left early. The drive back was quiet. Messages came in from Richard telling me to bring the papers back so we could do this right. My mom called and said, "Sign it to keep the peace." That night, I did not sleep much. I reviewed the documents line by line and noted the clause that allowed signature authority and the cosigner language that would make me dependent. This was not about care. It was about owning the narrative. By Christmas, the pressure increased. Richard mentioned changing the will and refinancing the house to cover investments. He had already talked to a realtor. He said it casually, like it was decided. I realized then that silence had a cost and that the bill was coming due. So I invited him. "You like giving advice, right?" I said. "Come see a property I'm working on. Maybe you can tell me what you would do since you know reality." He agreed immediately. Pride is predictable. I made one call and said, "Schedule the walkthrough, keep it simple." The voice on the other end was respectful and brief. In Naples, the resort looked like itself, not flashy, just clean wood, bright air salt on the breeze. Richard critiqued the decor, asked who owned the place, talked down to staff. I asked quietly, "Did you say thank you?" He did not hear me. A concierge said, "Ms. Carter, your 2 p.m. is confirmed." Richard heard that and smiled, assuming what suited him. Then we walked into a meeting with people who expected clarity. Richard spoke again about kids and work and protecting me. The room went still waiting. The general manager said, "We'll need owner approval." I signed without ceremony. Richard asked owner. I said me. Silence filled the space and eyes shifted. That silence was the point where everything he had said came back to him at once. If that silence just hit your chest, comment, "Wow, so I know I am not alone." The pressure that night did not come out of nowhere. It had been building quietly for years in ways that were easy to dismiss if you were not the one standing in the middle of it. Looking back now, I can trace the pattern all the way to 2019 when Evan bought his first house. It was nothing extravagant, just a modest 3-bedroom in a planned community outside Naples, but the way it was celebrated, you would have thought he had achieved something historic. Richard told the story to anyone who would listen about how Evan was doing things the right way, how stability mattered, how owning property meant you were serious about life. My mom nodded along, smiling too quickly, bringing out photos offering details no one asked for. I stood there holding a glass of iced tea, listening to my own name disappear from the conversation. When someone asked what I was doing, Richard laughed and said something vague about laptops and hotels and travel, like it was a phase I would outgrow. My mom jumped in to smooth it over, saying I was figuring things out and that everyone moved at their own pace. That was her role, always to stand between without ever actually standing with me. Over the next few years, that pattern repeated itself in smaller moments that stacked up quietly. Evan got praised for consistency, for showing up at the same job year after year, even when he complained about it nonstop. I got questioned for flexibility, for moving between projects, for working remotely, for not having something simple to point to when people asked what I did. At family gatherings, Richard liked to frame it as humor. He would say things like, "She is not a failure, she is just still loading," and then pause long enough for the laughter to land. People laughed because he laughed first, and because laughing was easier than pushing back. I learned to smile at the right moments and keep my answers short. It was safer that way. What hurt more than the jokes was how easily my mom accepted them. She would say, "He does not mean it like that," or "You know how he is," or "Just let it go." Peacekeeping became her default, even when keeping the peace meant sacrificing me. By 2021, Richard started talking more openly about responsibility and management. It came up whenever my mom mentioned anything related to the house: repairs, taxes, insurance. He would shake his head and say these things get complicated at our age and someone needs to be in charge. He never said Evan should take that role. He never suggested my mom could handle it herself. Instead, he would look at me and say, "Some people are not built for details or consistency," and then glance back at my mom as if the conclusion was obvious. The implication was clear even if it was never stated outright. I was unreliable. I was a risk. I was not someone you trusted with authority. Around that same time, the roof on my mom's house needed repairs after a storm. I arranged it quickly, called a contractor, paid the invoice the same afternoon, and never mentioned it again. When my mom thanked me later, Richard waved it off and said that was nice, but these things add up and should really be planned better. He did not ask how I paid for it. He did not seem curious. He had already decided what category I belonged in. In 2022, the comments sharpened. Evan refinanced his house, and Richard praised him for being smart with money. When I traveled more frequently for work, Richard joked that it must be nice to float around without roots. My mom started asking questions that sounded concerned but felt rehearsed. Are you saving enough? Do you have a plan? What happens if things dry up? I answered politely every time without explaining, because explaining never led anywhere. Sometimes during dinners, my phone would buzz and I would excuse myself to take a call in the hallway. The calls were always short. "Send the revised terms," I would say, or "yes, that works," and then I would hang up and return to the table. Richard would raise an eyebrow and joke about mysterious business while Evan smirked. No one ever followed up. They did not want details. Details would complicate the story they had settled on. By 2023, the idea that my mom's assets needed oversight had become a casual talking point. Richard framed it as protection. He talked about friends who had been taken advantage of by their own kids or had made bad decisions because no one stepped in early enough. He would say these things while looking directly at me and then back at my mom. She would sigh and say, "Maybe we should talk about that sometime." I felt something shift then. Not anger exactly, but a tightening awareness. This was not about concern. This was about control, slowly dressed up as responsibility. Still, I stayed quiet because staying quiet had become a habit, and habits are hard to break even when they hurt you. The week of Thanksgiving in 2024, everything accelerated. Evan was praised again this time for planning a kitchen renovation. Richard told the story twice. When I mentioned a work trip coming up, he cut me off with another joke about loading screens, and everyone laughed on cue. Later that night, when the guests were distracted, I walked past the kitchen and heard my mom speaking in a low voice. "If she signs, it will be easier for everyone," she said. Easier. The word landed heavy because I finally understood who everyone was included in and who it was not. That was the moment something in me settled. This was not just disrespect. It was an attempt to reduce me to a problem that needed managing. And problems do not get a vote. Quick question: have you ever been the peacekeeper in a family, or the one forced to stay quiet? I never thought of my life as hidden. It just existed in a different lane than the one my family liked to watch. I lived in Miami because that was where my work made sense. Hospitality runs on relationships, timing, and proximity, and Miami was a place where meetings happened without ceremony. I rented a quiet apartment near the water, nothing flashy, nothing that invited questions. My days were structured and predictable in ways that would probably surprise anyone who thought I drifted. I worked through a holding company because that is how most people in this space do it. It was not secrecy, it was practicality. The resort itself sat along the coast of Southwest Florida, the kind of place people visited to slow down, not to take pictures of owners. I did not manage it personally day to day. There was a general manager who had been in the industry longer than I had been alive, and an asset management firm that handled the numbers, compliance, insurance, and reporting. My role was oversight, decisions, approvals, and long-term planning. I never stood in photos because no one needed me to. The brand mattered, not my face. That was always enough for me. My life followed small routines. Morning calls, afternoon emails, site visits scheduled weeks out. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would look impressive at a dinner table. Sometimes my phone would ring, and it would be my banker using my first name the way people do when they have worked together for a while. He would ask about terms, interest rates, timelines. I would answer calmly and move on. Sometimes an email would come in from a county inspector confirming a walkthrough date, or from an insurance broker clarifying coverage details after a storm. I would read it, respond briefly, and archive it. None of it felt extraordinary to me anymore. It was just the texture of my days. I never shared these things with my family because sharing never led to understanding. It led to jokes or disbelief or advice I did not ask for. So I kept my world separate without thinking of it as hiding. Back in Naples, the messages started to pile up. Richard texted first. "Bring those papers back. We will do this right." The wording mattered. We? As if my consent was a formality already granted. A few minutes later, my mom called. Her voice was tight, the way it gets when she is trying to keep everything from tipping over. "Sign it for peace," she said. "Just sign it, and we can all move on." I looked at my phone for a long moment before responding. I said I needed time. She sighed like I had disappointed her again. Over the next few days, the pressure crept closer. Richard followed up with another message about responsibility and family duty. Evan sent a neutral-sounding note asking if everything was okay. No one asked what I wanted, no one asked why I hesitated. They only asked when I would comply. Meanwhile, my work continued uninterrupted. I approved a revised vendor contract during a layover. I reviewed a quarterly report while sitting at my kitchen counter. The contrast was jarring. In one part of my life, my judgment was trusted without question. In another, it was dismissed before I even spoke. One afternoon, I flew down to the resort for a routine visit. The general manager walked me through updates. Occupancy numbers were steady. A minor maintenance issue had been resolved. We discussed a potential partnership with a local charity board for community programming. Everything moved smoothly because everyone involved understood their role. No one talked over me. No one made jokes. No one questioned whether I was capable of understanding the details. That was when the realization settled fully. This was not just about disrespect. It was about control. Richard was not trying to help my mom or protect her assets. He was trying to formalize a hierarchy that placed him above me and kept me small enough to manage. The papers were not about convenience. They were about authority. The calls and texts were not concern. They were countdowns. Back in Miami, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Richard reminding me to bring the documents by the weekend. I imagined the scene already. The envelope, the pens, the expectant looks. I thought about my mom standing between us trying to keep the peace by asking me to give in. I thought about how often peace was achieved by sacrificing the quiet one. That night, I sat at my desk and reviewed the documents one last time. I highlighted the clauses that transferred decision-making power and the cosigner language that would entangle my finances with choices I did not make. It was all very ordinary, very legal, very irreversible. I closed the file and took a breath. This was the moment. Not a dramatic one, not a loud one, but a clear one. I understood then that staying silent would not keep me safe. It would only make the control permanent. The tone changed after that. It stopped sounding like concern and started sounding like consequences. Richard did not raise his voice or lose his temper. He did not need to. He simply laid out what would happen if I did not sign, as if he were explaining a process everyone already understood. He told my mom in front of me that if I refused to cooperate, then there was no point in keeping things cordial. He said distance might be healthier for everyone, and that sometimes cutting contact was necessary when someone refused to grow up. My mom went quiet and stared at the table. He continued without pause. He said he would advise her to revisit her estate planning because intentions change and documents should reflect reality. He mentioned refinancing the house to cover debts or investments and said it casually as if it were a household chore. The words refinance and equity and timing floated through the room like they were harmless. I knew better. Those were not suggestions. They were leverage. The next day my mom called again. Her voice was tired and thin. She said Richard had been talking to people. She did not say who at first, but then admitted he had mentioned a realtor he trusted and someone who handled family matters. She said he was only gathering information, but the way she said it told me she believed it was already in motion. I asked her if she wanted this. She said she just wanted everyone to stop fighting. I realized then that peace was the currency being demanded and my signature was the price. Richard followed up with a message that same afternoon. If you do not sign, we will need to make other arrangements. He added that family support was not unconditional and that choices had consequences. He ended with a line about how he had tried to help. I read it twice and felt something settle into place. This was no longer about documents. It was about obedience. A few days later, I received an email notification by mistake. It was addressed to Richard, but my address was copied. It mentioned preliminary questions about refinancing options and timing considerations. The sender was someone with a title that suggested legal familiarity. I did not reply. I did not forward it. I simply saved it. The confirmation was enough. He had already reached out. He had already framed the situation as one that required intervention. The escalation was complete. I went back to the documents and read them slowly, this time not as a daughter, but as someone trained to notice details. There it was, buried in the language. Signature authority granted under specific conditions. Co-signer obligations that extended beyond the immediate transaction. Clauses that shifted decision-making power quietly but permanently. If I signed, I would not just be agreeing to help. I would be giving up the ability to refuse later. I felt a sharp, clean pain at the realization. Not panic, not fear, clarity. He was not trying to help. He was trying to own the narrative. I did not cry. I did not argue. I watched. I noticed how Richard framed every threat as advice and every demand as logic. I noticed how my mom repeated his words when she spoke to me as if they had become facts. I noticed how Evan stayed out of it, completely benefiting from the outcome without taking responsibility for the pressure. The line had been crossed not with anger but with paperwork and timing and implied loss. That made it worse. It made it harder to explain and easier to dismiss if I tried to protest. That was the point. I thought about the house and the memories tied to it and how quickly it could become a bargaining chip. I thought about how easily my absence could be justified once I was labeled difficult. I understood then that waiting would only make the control more complete. Silence would be interpreted as consent. Compliance would be rewarded temporarily and punished later. That night, Richard sent one more message reminding me of the weekend deadline. He added that if I valued family, I would not force his hand. I stared at the screen and felt the weight of the choice he thought he had cornered me into. He believed the threat of loss would make me fold. He believed proximity equaled power. He was wrong about one thing, and that mattered more than anything else. If you have ever felt your family loved you only when you complied, hit like so YouTube shows this to someone who needs it. I did not confront Richard after that. I did not argue or defend myself or ask him to reconsider. I let the silence do what it always did in our family, which was make him uncomfortable enough to fill it himself. A few days passed and then I called him. My tone was neutral, the way it always was when I did not want to invite commentary. I said I had been thinking about what he said about responsibility and perspective. I told him he was right about one thing, which was that experience mattered. He perked up immediately. I could hear it in the way he breathed into the phone, waiting for the compliment to land. I said, "You like giving advice, right?" There was a pause, and then a small laugh. "Of course," he said. I continued carefully, choosing words that sounded ordinary. "Come see a property I am working on. Maybe you can tell me what you would do since you know reality." I did not say anything else. I did not explain what kind of property or where or why. I left space for him to fill with his own assumptions. He took it eagerly. He said he would be happy to help, and that this was the kind of initiative he had been hoping to see from me. He added that maybe seeing things up close would help me understand how the world really worked. I agreed and said I would send details. When I hung up, I felt the shift. The pressure that had been pushing down on me eased just enough to let me move. That night I made one call. It lasted less than a minute. Schedule the walkthrough. Keep it simple. The voice on the other end said, "Yes, Ms. Carter," without hesitation, and asked what time worked best. I chose a time that aligned with a routine meeting already on the calendar. No adjustments were needed. Everything else was already in place. I did not tell my mom what I was doing. I did not tell Evan. I did not feel the need to. The invitation was not for them. It was for Richard, and for the version of himself he could not resist proving. Over the next few days, he mentioned the visit repeatedly in ways that revealed exactly what he thought was happening. He told my mom he was going to check on me. He told Evan he was curious to see what kind of place I was involved with. He joked about hard truths and learning opportunities. My mom sounded relieved when she mentioned it to me on the phone. She said maybe this would clear the air and that sometimes seeing things helps people understand. I said maybe and let it sit there. I booked a flight and kept my routine unchanged. Calls, meetings, emails all continued as usual. I reviewed a proposal from the asset management firm and sent back minor notes. I confirmed attendance with a local partner for a later meeting. Nothing about my days suggested anything dramatic was coming. That was important. I wanted the moment to arrive without fanfare. On the morning of the visit, Richard texted asking what he should wear. I told him casual was fine. He replied with a thumbs up and a comment about dressing for success anyway. I smiled to myself. When we met, he was already in that mode where he scanned his surroundings and made quick judgments. He commented on the drive, the neighborhood, the entrance. He asked who owned the place, as if ownership were a title that automatically conferred relevance. I answered questions plainly without adding context. I said I was involved in operations and that I worked with a team. That satisfied him because it fit the story he wanted. Inside, I stayed quiet. I noticed how he spoke to people and how they responded. I noticed how easily he assumed authority and how little he listened. The call I had made earlier ensured everything unfolded as scheduled. The general manager greeted me briefly and professionally. A staff member checked a list and nodded. Richard took it all in with interest, mistaking courtesy for deference. He leaned toward me at one point and said, "This is good experience for you. You see how things are run." I nodded. I let him believe what he needed to believe. As we walked toward the meeting area, my phone buzzed with a confirmation. 2 p.m. was locked in. I silenced it and kept moving. I felt steady, not triumphant, not nervous, just focused. This was not about revealing anything yet. This was about letting the environment do what it always did, which was clarify roles without words. When Richard made another comment about advice and reality, I did not respond. I simply opened the door and stepped forward. The stage was set, and he had walked onto it willingly. Azure Key Retreat never announced itself loudly. That was intentional. The entrance opened into a bright wooden lobby, where sunlight filtered through wide glass panels, and the air carried a faint scent of salt and citrus from the cleaning oils used on the floors. Nothing glittered, nothing shouted wealth. It felt calm in a way that made people lower their voices without being asked. Richard stepped inside and immediately scanned the space like he was evaluating it for flaws. He commented on the wood tones, first saying they were understated, and asked whether eco-materials really held up long-term. He did not wait for an answer. He moved toward the concierge desk and leaned on it slightly too hard. "Who owns this place?" he asked, as if ownership were the only thing worth knowing. The concierge smiled politely and said she would be happy to connect him with someone who could help. Richard waved her off and said he was just curious. I watched the exchange quietly. The golf cart path curved outside toward the guest villas, and the sound of wheels on stone drifted in through the open doors. A staff member passed by and greeted us. Richard nodded without looking at her and continued talking about how decor choices often revealed inexperience. I followed him at an even pace, noticing the way the staff adjusted their body language around him, becoming more formal, more careful. It was subtle but visible if you knew how to look. As we walked, he kept narrating his thoughts as if this were a tour he was leading. He pointed out details he would change and asked again who owned the place. I said it was managed by a team and that decisions were made collaboratively. He snorted lightly and said that usually meant someone was in over their head. We passed the concierge desk again and a different staff member approached holding a tablet. She glanced at me and said, "Ms. Carter, your 2 p.m. is confirmed." Her tone was calm and respectful, like this was routine. Richard heard it, and his eyebrows lifted. He looked at me with interest, and then at the staff member. 2 p.m. for what he asked. She smiled and said she would defer to me and stepped back. Richard laughed and said, "Must be some kind of presentation or vendor thing." He leaned in and whispered that it was good I was being included. I did not correct him. We continued down a hallway that led toward a quieter wing. The lighting softened and the noise faded. This was where meetings happened, where people spoke in measured sentences and listened carefully. Richard slowed his pace and adjusted his posture. He asked if this was the owner's area. I said it was a private office space. He nodded approvingly and said that made sense. As we waited, he struck up a conversation with a staff member about operations. He spoke over her answers, correcting details he did not have. When she thanked him for his input, he smiled as if he had done her a favor. I watched her walk away and felt the familiar tightness in my chest. I turned to him and asked very quietly, "Did you say thank you?" He blinked, surprised, and then shrugged, saying, "Of course," he was polite. He moved on without reconsidering. Inside my head, I noted the pattern again. Courtesy offered only when it cost nothing. The general manager arrived a moment later and greeted me by name. She acknowledged Richard politely and asked if we were ready to begin. Richard stepped forward and started explaining why he was there, saying he was advising me and wanted to make sure I was not being taken advantage of. The general manager listened without interruption and then looked to me for confirmation. I nodded once. She led us into the meeting room where the windows overlooked the water. The room was simple, a long table, chairs, neatly arranged, documents prepared. Richard took a seat near the head of the table without asking. He commented on the view and said it must be nice to work somewhere like this. The staff moved around him with practiced ease. He asked questions that assumed authority and offered opinions no one requested. I answered when necessary and otherwise remained still. Inside, I felt calm. This space was familiar to me. The rhythm of meetings, the cadence of decisions, the quiet respect that came from clarity. Richard did not notice the shift because he was too busy performing. When the general manager asked for owner approval on a minor item, she turned to me automatically. I reviewed the page and signed. It was a small gesture, but the room responded to it. Richard noticed then. He leaned forward and asked what that was. I said it was an approval. He asked owner approval. I said yes. He laughed uncertainly and said, "So you work closely with them." I met his eyes and said, "I am the owner." The room went silent in a way that was not dramatic, but complete. No one rushed to fill it. The staff simply waited. Richard opened his mouth and closed it. He looked around as if expecting someone to contradict me. No one did. The silence did not accuse him. It revealed him. Pay attention here. How someone treats staff tells you everything. The meeting was scheduled as an owner briefing, and it was the kind that happened quietly every quarter without announcements or ceremony. The general manager had prepared a short agenda, and the finance manager was already seated reviewing numbers on a tablet. A county official arrived a few minutes later to confirm compliance updates related to coastal regulations, and an insurance adjuster joined to finalize coverage adjustments after the last storm season. None of them looked surprised to see me. They greeted me by name and waited. Richard followed me into the room without asking. He pulled out a chair and sat down as if this were expected. He leaned back and crossed his arms, surveying the room with the same confidence he always carried when he believed he belonged somewhere by default. The general manager paused briefly, and then continued as planned. The room was quiet in that professional way where everyone knows their role and does not waste time asserting it. Richard did not pick up on that. He cleared his throat and spoke before anyone asked him to. He said kids these days, they do not know what work is, and laughed lightly as if inviting agreement. No one laughed. He went on saying he was there to make sure I did not get taken advantage of because young people could be too trusting. The county official glanced at me and then back to the general manager. The finance manager stopped scrolling and waited. The insurance adjuster folded his hands and looked at me steadily. I said nothing. I let the silence stretch just long enough for his words to hang there unsupported. The general manager resumed the agenda and reviewed occupancy figures and maintenance updates. Richard interrupted once to suggest a cost-saving measure that did not apply. The finance manager corrected it politely and moved on. Richard frowned and shifted in his seat. The county official discussed permitting timelines and environmental compliance. Richard nodded as if he understood, but then added a comment about how regulations made it harder for real owners to get things done. The official looked at me again, waiting. I nodded once to indicate acknowledgement, and the conversation continued. Richard tried again, saying he wanted to see the numbers himself. The finance manager said those were reviewed with ownership regularly. He emphasized the word ownership without looking at Richard. The room adjusted its attention back to me. When the agenda reached approvals, the general manager turned to me and said, "We will need owner approval to proceed with the vendor contract update and the revised insurance terms." She slid the documents toward me. I reviewed them quickly, noting that everything aligned with what we had discussed earlier. I signed where indicated and passed them back. It was efficient. It was ordinary. It was work. Richard leaned forward, then, unable to contain himself. "Owner approval," he repeated. He looked at the documents and then at me. He asked who the owner was, as if this were a misunderstanding that needed correction. I looked up and said me. The word landed softly, and yet the room changed instantly. No one gasped. No one reacted dramatically. They simply accepted it. The county official nodded once, as if a question had been answered. The finance manager continued taking notes. The insurance adjuster checked a box on his form. The general manager waited for my next instruction. Richard sat frozen. He looked around expecting confusion or challenge. There was none. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was complete. It filled the room because nothing else needed to be said. Richard opened his mouth and closed it. His face shifted through disbelief calculation and something like embarrassment. He tried to laugh it off, saying, "Well, that is impressive," and that he had not realized. No one responded. The meeting moved on. The general manager asked if there were any questions from ownership. I shook my head. The county official thanked me for my time and said he appreciated the clear communication. The insurance adjuster confirmed next steps. The finance manager gathered his papers. The meeting ended the way meetings always did, with handshakes and brief acknowledgments. Richard remained seated for a moment longer, staring at the table. When he stood, his movements were slower. He tried to speak again, saying he had only wanted to help. The general manager smiled politely and said, "Of course," and escorted the others out. When the door closed, Richard turned to me and asked why I had not told him. I said there had never been a reason. He said family deserved to know. I said family deserved respect first. He looked down at the papers on the table as if they might explain something. The room felt smaller now, not because of tension, but because the truth had taken up all the space. If that silence just hit your chest, comment, "Wow, I want to know I am not alone." The shift in Richard happened almost immediately after the room emptied. The confidence he had carried minutes earlier drained away and was replaced by a careful tone I had never heard from him before. He asked if we could talk privately and gestured toward the window as if proximity might restore his footing. I did not raise my voice or mirror his urgency. I said we could talk, but not here and not now. He nodded quickly and said he understood, and then added that he could help me expand if I wanted. He said he knew people and had connections, and that this could be a good opportunity for both of us. The words help and opportunity sounded different coming from him now, thinner, more calculated. I told him calmly that we do not work with people who belittle staff. He frowned as if that rule were unreasonable. He said he was just joking earlier, and that people were too sensitive these days. I repeated the sentence exactly the same way. We do not work with people who belittle staff. There was nothing emotional in it. It was a standard, not a punishment. He tried again, saying family should be able to speak freely, and that intentions mattered more than tone. I told him intentions did not erase patterns, and patterns were what informed decisions. He went quiet then, and asked if we could at least talk later. I said maybe, and turned to leave. Over the next few days, the consequences unfolded without my involvement. Richard had already told friends at the club that he was advising on a major property and that things were moving in a promising direction. He had framed it as a win before it existed. When word spread that the property was owned by me and that I was not partnering with him, the story shifted. The same people who had nodded along now asked questions he could not answer. Around the same time, the refinancing he had been counting on stalled. The bank required documentation he could not produce, and the timing no longer worked. The HELOC application was denied, and the explanation was routine, insufficient collateral and unresolved obligations. It was not dramatic, it was just final. He called me again after that. This time his voice carried urgency rather than authority. He said things were complicated and that family should help family. He asked if I could co-sign something just temporarily to get him through a rough patch. I listened and then said no, I did not justify it. I did not remind him of the papers he had tried to push across the table. I simply said no. He accused me of holding a grudge. I said I was holding a boundary. He said I was being cruel. I said cruelty would be using power to humiliate someone publicly. I had not done that. I had simply declined to reward it. My mom called next. She cried and said she did not understand how things had gone so wrong so quickly. She said Richard felt exposed and embarrassed. I told her exposure was not something I caused. It happened when truth met an audience. She asked if I could reconsider for the sake of peace. I said peace that requires silence is not peace. It is compliance. She went quiet and said she needed time. I said I understood. Evan sent a short message asking if everything was okay and if I could maybe help Richard out just this once. I did not reply. That was part of the consequence too, not engaging with requests that assumed access. The justice in all of this was not loud. There were no raised voices or ultimatums. There was simply a line, and the reality that crossed it had a cost. Richard did not lose everything. He did not suffer publicly beyond the embarrassment of his own words. He simply did not gain what he expected. The expansion he imagined was not offered. The influence he tried to assert did not materialize. The leverage he believed he had dissolved because it was never his to begin with. I did not take anything from him. I did not expose private details or retaliate. I just did not include him. For people my age, that might seem unsatisfying. For people older, it feels right. Justice is not about balance through harm. It is about alignment through standards. The staff at Azure Key continued their work without disruption. The general manager thanked me for clarity and said it made things easier. The finance manager adjusted projections and moved forward. Life went on in a way that felt lighter. Richard called one last time and said he hoped we could move past this. I said moving past something requires moving differently. He did not answer. The silence that followed was not punishment. It was space. January 2025 arrived quietly, and with it a cold clarity I had not felt before. The holidays had passed without incident, mostly because I had kept my distance, and no one pushed hard enough to break it. That changed one afternoon when my phone rang, and the caller ID showed my mother's number. I answered and heard her crying before she spoke. She said Richard was there and that he wanted to talk. She said we were family and that families talked things through even when things were uncomfortable. I did not respond right away. I listened. A few minutes later, I heard Richard's voice in the background asking if I was coming over or if he should drive to me. He took the phone and said, "We are family, and you owe us a conversation." The word "owe" landed exactly where he intended. I told him I would come by, but only to speak briefly. When I arrived at my mother's house, the atmosphere was heavy. Linda sat on the couch with tissues in her lap. Richard stood near the window, arms crossed, trying to look patient. He started immediately saying that everything had gotten out of hand and that misunderstandings happen. He said he never meant to hurt me and that intentions should count for something. He did not apologize. He talked about stress and timing and how people say things they do not mean. My mother wiped her eyes and said she just wanted peace. She asked if we could all reset and move forward. I asked Richard what moving forward looked like to him. He hesitated, and then said practical things needed to be addressed. He said Evan was struggling at work and could use an opportunity. He said a position at the resort would be perfect, something entry-level to get his foot in the door. He added that a short-term loan would also help smooth things over while he sorted out some financial issues. He said co-signing would be easiest since I understood how these things worked. The room went quiet. My mother looked hopeful, like this might be the compromise that fixed everything. I felt no anger. I felt distance. I told him calmly that I was not punishing him and that I was choosing distance. He frowned and said that sounded dramatic. I said it was simply accurate. He said families help each other. I said help that comes with conditions is control. He said I was being cold. I said I was being clear. My mother asked if I could at least consider helping Evan. I said Evan was capable of finding his own path the same way I had. Richard interrupted and said this was different because he was asking now and because things were tight. I asked him if he was apologizing. He said he did not think apologies were necessary when everyone had contributed to the conflict. I nodded and said that answered my question. I stood up and told them I would be stepping back. My mother cried harder and asked how long. I said until things changed. Richard said that was unfair and that I was using my position to make a point. I said the point had been made long before I ever spoke. As I walked to the door, Richard said one more thing. He said I should remember where I came from. I turned and said I had never forgotten, and that was the problem. Over the next weeks, I followed through on what I had decided. I stopped covering small expenses for my mother that I had handled quietly for years. I did not announce it. I simply did not step in. I stopped answering calls that circled back to money or favors. Richard tried once more to reach out through a mutual acquaintance, suggesting we meet and talk business. I declined. Without my involvement, he had to face the reality he had been avoiding. The debts did not disappear. The reputation he had hinted at with friends did not hold up. He had to explain why the opportunity he bragged about never materialized. Evan found work on his own eventually. It was not glamorous, and it was not handed to him. My mother adjusted slowly to the absence of the cushion I had provided. We spoke occasionally but carefully. Richard did not call again. The distance held. It was not dramatic or satisfying in a loud way. It was effective. The audacity of returning without accountability met a boundary that did not bend. The consequence was simple and lasting. I was no longer available to absorb the cost of someone else's control. The quiet that followed was not empty. It was spacious. It felt like stepping out of a crowded room into fresh air and realizing how long I had been holding my breath. I did not announce a victory or frame what happened as a triumph. There was nothing to prove anymore. I simply exhaled and noticed that my shoulders dropped for the first time in years. The days that followed were ordinary in the best way. I returned to my routines in Miami and to the steady rhythm of work that did not ask me to perform or defend myself. I walked along the water in the mornings and answered emails without tension in my chest. I noticed how much energy I had been spending anticipating reactions that never came. Healing did not arrive as a single moment. It arrived as small absences. The absence of anxiety when my phone rang. The absence of rehearsed explanations in my head. The absence of the need to soften my words to keep someone else comfortable. I did not cut my family out completely. I simply stopped trying to manage their feelings for them. That was the boundary. It was quiet and firm, and it held. My mother and I spoke occasionally, and our conversations were careful but honest. We did not circle back to money or favors. We talked about weather and memories and plans that did not require agreement. Richard was no longer part of my daily awareness. That absence was not punishment, it was peace. I learned something in that space that felt especially true the older I got. Peace is not when they finally respect you. It is when you stop auditioning for it. For years I had been performing patience and understanding and restraint, hoping that one day it would be enough to earn a different outcome. It never was. The outcome only changed when I changed what I was willing to tolerate. I also learned that some families do not want you to fail. They want you to stay small. Small enough to manage. Small enough to explain. Small enough to use as a contrast for their own choices. When you grow beyond that role, it feels like betrayal to them, even when it is simply growth. And the older you get, the more expensive silence becomes. It costs time, energy, and self-respect. I paid that cost for a long time without realizing it, because it felt easier than conflict. What I understand now is that silence is only peaceful when it is chosen, not when it is imposed. I did not need an apology to move forward. I needed clarity. I needed to see the pattern clearly enough to stop participating in it. That clarity did not make me angry. It made me calm. Calm enough to choose distance without bitterness. Calm enough to let consequences unfold without interference. Calm enough to trust that a boundary does not need to be loud to be effective. There was no dramatic ending scene, no reconciliation speech, no promise that everything would be perfect from that point on. Life continued with its usual mix of responsibility and uncertainty. The difference was that I was no longer carrying weight that was never mine to hold. I was no longer measuring my worth by how well I kept things smooth for other people. I was simply living my life on terms that made sense to me. That was enough. If you have ever had to set a boundary with family, share your story below. Someone will need it.